Hello, I'm Marcus Railton, and welcome back to the second series of the ScotsCare podcast. ScotsCare is the only charity dedicated to helping disadvantaged Scots in London through a range of support, including financial grants, advocacy, counselling and sheltered housing for older Scots, job coaching, social events, befriending and support for children and families. The charity's been running for 400 years to help break the cycle of poverty experienced by some Scots. In the new series, I'll be chatting with guests from all walks of life, from celebrities and authors, athletes and actors, business entrepreneurs to academics, all with one thing in common: Scots heritage. And they enjoy a good blether. On the podcast today is Brett Grellier, a psychologist with expertise in treating people for addiction, trauma, depression and anxiety. I recorded this chat with Brett a while back. The world is a complicated place at the moment, and I wanted to ask him about his expertise, but also about getting through the day-to-day and making the most of the gift of life. We chatted about coping mechanisms, how we have evolved as a species, perhaps better technically than emotionally. And towards the end of our chat, I asked Brett, a man of science, if he had a faith, and if having a faith may make it easier for some of us in the long run. Brett was very generous with his time, so here we go on the ScotsCare podcast with Brett Grellier.
Hi, Marcus.
Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Really happy to do anything to help ScotsCare.
So for anyone who doesn't know what you do, or anyone who's just coming to the ScotsCare podcast for the first time, can you introduce yourself? Tell us who you are and what your qualifications are.
Sure. So my name's Brett Grellier. I'm a counselling psychologist, and I work in the homeless sector. So before I trained as a psychologist, I was working in a hostel as a project worker for 4 years with people who'd experienced street homelessness, and then worked in street outreach, was latterly the manager of that street outreach team in Westminster. And it was at that time I met some of the people who still work for ScotsCare now. So I've known the ScotsCare organisation for some time. Then worked in the NHS, specialised in addictions and trauma. But at the same time, I was doing a few sessions with clients and reflective practice sessions with teams. And eventually that work just built up and built up. So I opened a company called BGPS in 2016. And the idea being bringing psychological therapies to people who wouldn't otherwise be able to access them. So people who have been street homeless, who are living in hostel accommodation or going to soup kitchens, because I guess my experience showed that people could really benefit from these therapies, and it was the system that was the problem, not the fact that the people couldn't avail themselves of it or make use of those therapies.
Brett, I said in the introduction that as part of your practice and being a specialist in addiction, trauma and anxiety, you give mental health support to some ScotsCare clients. Can you tell us a bit about how that works and what kind of ScotsCare clients you mainly support?
Sure. So we work broadly with two cohorts: people experiencing homelessness and people struggling with alcohol addiction, although there's obviously a lot of crossover between those two, some overlap between those two groups. And all are adults from 18 to end of life. We meet people where they feel most comfortable, including community settings, home visits, and also in more traditional therapy rooms. And the number of sessions can range from 1 or 2 to carry out an assessment to help the person apply for benefits, for example, or to take to their GP to demonstrate their mental health challenges, or up to 1 or 2 years providing long-term therapy.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned that the word challenges there, and so what challenges or maybe issues would someone that you support typically be facing?
People we're working with present with a range of issues, including poor physical health, financial difficulties, multiple barriers to accessing the basics, such as a bank account and somewhere safe to live. So our partnership with ScotsCare is really important here, because the support workers do amazing work advocating for the clients and helping them achieve some of these
to overcome some of these barriers and to get those needs met. From a mental health perspective, all the people we see have experienced multiple traumatic experiences throughout their lives, including neglect and abuse during childhood, which leads to often people have diagnoses of PTSD and other mental health issues, along with difficulties trusting other people, often have a really highly negative self-view and difficulties regulating their emotions and behavior. And so those elements together with PTSD makes complex PTSD. So a huge part of our work involves relational, emotional, and behavioral regulation. So helping people to manage their triggers, to begin to trust new people. So that therapy relationship, their relationship with the ScotsCare worker are key in their recovery. I can't express how important those relationships are. And so we then, in longer term work, we use evidence-based therapies to work through traumatic memories, to help people heal and recover from the traumatic incidents they've experienced. And with people who are experiencing alcohol addiction or dependence, we use recovery coaching, motivational interviewing, CBT to help people bring into conscious awareness some of those unconscious patterns and find techniques and coping strategies for reducing their use or stopping whatever they want to do.
It must be massively rewarding for you and your team when you see people go through this counselling journey and come out, whether it's coming out the other end or there's just a gradual progress and a gradual change in behaviour towards the positive. What kind of changes or progress do you notice with them as a result of the counselling?
Yeah, it's a great question, because the work is incredibly rewarding, starting off with someone who you can see has been so damaged by their experiences, and then really seeing them grow and develop into the person they always should have been, as they develop confidence and skills and are able to interact with the world. And, that's again in partnership with the ScotsCare workers. And our experience is that the vast majority of the clients that are referred to us attend appointments regularly, just as regularly as people in a open access mental health service, and people see reductions in their distress, increases in their well-being. And with long-term clients whose lives were severely restricted by that complex PTSD or other mental health issues, we see them make full recovery from their symptoms, maintain accommodation, participate in work, education, and begin to have healthy relationships. I mean, yes, it's long-term work. It's work that you have to do as a multi-agency. You can't do it on your own. We have to work with others. But when we can all see that person make gains and then tell us how much their lives have changed, yeah, there's nothing like it, to be fair, in terms of a sense of reward.
Can I ask you, and this is probably too big a question to be succinct about. We could probably do a whole podcast about this on its own, but I want to talk to you very briefly before we move on to other stuff, and maybe we'll come back to it later, is homelessness, and that's the connection to mental health and being homeless. How much does it exacerbate negative mental health when you are homeless or facing homelessness?
Sure. I mean, just have the instability of not having a safe, permanent place to live increases stress, anxiety, low mood, really difficult to focus on anything else in your life when those basics aren't attended to. Lack of access to basic necessities such as food, healthcare can worsen physical health and mental health. And just being out there, sleeping rough or being in temporary accommodation is stressful in itself. And people nearly always report that they've had traumatic incidents happen when they've been out sleeping rough. So yeah, absolutely. The isolation and the stigma associated with homelessness as well prevents people from seeking help, and that can further compound the struggles. The homelessness itself is a huge contributory factor.
I always wonder how people like yourself that do such good work remain or try to remain objective when you see people at soup kitchens. And I saw this article recently about a soup kitchen in the centre of Glasgow where I came from, and it was packed. And this is what you get up and you this is the kind of the world that you exist in day in and day out. So how do you keep your own sanity? How do you remain objective and go home and have a life that, doesn't tax you too emotionally?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it comes somewhat with experience. Certainly when I was first working in the homeless sector, you want to change the world and you think you can change the world, which is great. That's a wonderful thing about being young, isn't it? Um, yeah, and still, I'm not always objective. If I'm working with someone personally, then I, don't want to leave a stone unturned in terms of advocating for them, making sure they get their needs met, and opening the doors within the system to ensure they get what they deserve. However, in a bigger sense, running a company and having a number of colleagues who are working with clients as well, what I've learned over time is, I guess, to pick your battles, to think about how much energy and effort it's gonna take for the given result. And so actually, if it's very unlikely that a system's going to change, then maybe it's much better just to focus on the person and think about what's within my power and what's within my reach to help this person to make improvements in their lives.
I'm quite a skeptical person. Maybe I think maybe it's the Glaswegian in me. Maybe I'm cynical, and I keep hearing of it, especially on social media, that, we are talking about mental health more. We're helping out each other. And I wonder how much of that is virtue signaling to a certain extent. Do you see it getting better? Are people talking about it more? Do you think we are taking into consideration our mental health a bit more?
Yeah, again, it's such a complex question in a way, and it's multifaceted, because in many ways, yes, people are talking about their mental health more freely without quite so much fear of being stigmatized. And organizations, for example, have well-being programs and like to advertise the fact that they care about the mental health of their staff members. But the reality, I would suggest in many cases, is I don't think those are cynical ploys for the greatest most part. I don't think they're cynical ploys, but really, if there is a staff member who is struggling with neurodiversity or with a mental health issue, really, I think that the tools are still lacking in terms of how to accommodate for that person, how to support them appropriately, and still, more often than not, the team members feel disappointed and feel like that they weren't supported. Or in some cases, there is still a lack of psychological safety within organizations, and people feel, if I put my hand up and say that I'm struggling with depression or anxiety, then it means I'm less likely to be considered for a promotion, or that I'm going to be sidelined in different ways. And so I think there is a talking about mental health on social media, but at the same time, within the work context, I believe that people still fear stigmatization and still fear negative consequences if they are to share that they are suffering from a mental health problem, and they want the workplace to adjust for their needs.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is like, and it's a good first step. It is like turning an oil tanker, though, isn't it? I expect this is going to be very slow. And ScotsCare does a lot of good work in that area, with yourself. And there's another great charity that I follow called Mates in Mind, and they do a lot of mental health work with people who work in construction. But it's, I'm a quite liberal, Guardian reading, hippie type of 51-year-old man, but I still find it tough to go out there and talk and say, do you know what, I'm not okay today. I'm not feeling that great. And I remember there was a few years ago, I was working for a sports company, and it was a phenomenally aggressive atmosphere to work in. And there was a lot of bullying, and you couldn't ask for help. And I started having these panic attacks. And I remember going to the doctor and saying, I'm having these panic attacks because I just didn't want to go to work. I would stand there thinking, I can't do this because it's such an oppressive atmosphere to work in. Yeah. And the doctor was said to me, well, and I still remember this, Brett, because it was years ago. He said, have you thought about having a less stressful lifestyle? And you think, oh, yeah, that I could just retire and move to the countryside, but I need to pay the mortgage. And so I said, no, I can't do this. I've got kids. I've got to go out to work. And then, so I found that quite trite. And then he said, well, what about medication? And I was thinking, well, and it's kind of like what you were saying there. It's not just about getting the information or the help, it's getting the right help, isn't it? Because for me, his change your lifestyle, couldn't do it. Why don't you take some medication? I don't want to take medication. I've got to do the school run and get up and function and stuff like that. So it's also about getting the right help, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, that message, do you want to first check your environment before you decide that you're diagnosing yourself with a problem? We don't live in a vacuum, do we? And our immediate environment is going to impact on our well-being and our mental health. And I think there is a sense of that neoliberal view of the world, that you can give workers more volume of work, you can give them more difficult work, more challenging work, and expect more of them. But then it's up to the worker to look after their own well-being, and that means the companies, in a way, get away with piling on the work and really avoiding the actual problem, which is the volume and the type of work that people are being asked to complete. And obviously, there's that whole idea of not being able to switch off. People come home and still receive phone calls, emails about work. It sounds like the doctor you spoke to was quite forward thinking in focusing on the environment, and actually, do you need to make environmental changes rather than diagnosing yourself as having a mental health problem?
Yeah, I think men are probably, I don't know, not worse than women at it, or not as good at talking. I think men are kind of traditionally don't talk very well. When I read something, it was a BBC report just the other day talking about, it was a terrifying statistic saying like only 12% of men can say they've got really good friends. So I think there's a lot of men out there who don't have friends, who don't have someone just to sit down over a beer or a coffee or a cup of tea and talk it out with. And that can, just having someone else to talk to, surely that goes a long way just to making your world feel a tiny bit better.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a huge difference. And you've probably heard of Calm, the campaign against living miserably, who specifically work around men's mental health and try to get men talking to one another. And you're right, a lot of these issues, the first one you mentioned, we can't deny the fact that human beings view the world through dominance hierarchies. We're interested in, who's top of the food chain. And we adjust our behavior to fit in with whatever that perception is. And also, we're conditioned, aren't we, that boys don't cry, just shut up and get on with it, far more than girls are. And I think that social conditioning, that's been going on for many generations, and it isn't going to disappear overnight. And I guess we're talking a little bit about generations as well. You said you were 51, so I guess you're a Generation Xer. And so I'm in the same generation as you, and I think very much so that the answer was to just brush it under the carpet. Don't show what you lack, because you'll never get your money back or something like that. But maybe things are. I hope things are changing for the Generation Z population. They have different expectations of the workplace. They talk about their mental health more openly than perhaps we do. I don't know. What do you think? Do you see a difference in the younger generation and how they talk about mental health?
Yeah, well, I've got a 14-year-old. I've got three kids, 14 and 10 are my two boys, and my daughter is 4. Okay. Yeah, and my 14-year-old boy, he's quite laid back. I think he's quite a laid back character, whereas my 10-year-old's a lot more. He's a bit of a different. He's a bit more highly strung. But yeah, I do see it in. I don't see them getting so worked up about the workplace, the younger people these days. I mean, I could be wrong. I could be sounding like a dinosaur. Whereas I think when I went into a job, I would have to do the best, and I had to stay there for 5 years or 6 years or 7 years because you didn't want to lose face, and you didn't want to look as if you couldn't hack it, And I worked in news for a long time, and that's quite an angry, oppressive place to work. Whereas I see young people kind of saying, this doesn't work out for me, I'm going to move on, and I feel okay about that. And that does seem to be a healthier attitude to life to have.
Yeah, I agree with you. And, organizations will have to catch up and make their workplace appealing to those people as we move into retirement, in the next 15 to 20 years, this generation.
1 in 4 of us will experience a form of mental health illness in our lifetime. ScotsCare offers mental health supports with quick access to qualified therapists for both children and adults, bypassing NHS waiting lists. If you're a low-income Scot in London and could use the help, get in touch with us.
Can we talk about the difference? Because I think a lot of people say, "Oh God, I'm depressed," but they're not actually depressed. You know, can we talk about the difference between low mood and low level anxiety and depression? Can you kind of give us a bit on that?
Yeah. So depression, low mood is certainly a component of depression. But one of the key symptoms of depression is lack of motivation. So it's not just I can't be bothered to go to work today. It's literally your body, your whole system just does not allow you to get out of bed or to get down to the kitchen to make a coffee. So the whole system is retreating essentially, and so that's the most pertinent symptom of depression. And then you've got low mood, poor concentration, poor memory. And these result from the executive functioning part of the brain shutting down or slowing down when a person's depressed. Also, people often have very negative self-views when they're depressed, which are, I'm worthless, I'm not important, no one cares about me, those kind of very negative ideas. So that there's something called the cognitive triad. So you have a negative view of yourself, negative view of the world around you, and a negative view of the future, which are all key elements of depression. I mean, would it be helpful to say a little bit about the environmental evolutionary model of depression and why evolutionary psychologists believe that becoming depressed would have been adaptive at some point?
Oh yeah. I'd like to know about that. Yeah.
Okay, I'll try to be quick and not boring. So the idea is that our brains and bodies have developed for a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. So 99.5% of the time that humans have been on the earth, we've been in hunter-gatherer groups of probably, between 75 to maybe 150 people, depending on the size of the group. And so the idea is that we're highly attuned to any form of social threat because we're group animals. So if we feel that we've transcended group rules in some way, or we're in trouble with people higher up in the hierarchy, that could be a risk to our life. So, for example, if we're living in a small tribe and you go along and steal some of the food store for your family, and then you get caught by the chief, what might happen to you?
Well, you'd be in trouble, wouldn't you? Big trouble at that point.
Yeah, you would be. So you would be severely punished, maybe even killed, or you could be kicked out of the tribe, and being kicked out of the tribe is almost certain death, living in hunter-gatherer societies. So when we feel we've transgressed social rules, we can retreat into depression. So the idea is, if in the social group I've done something to upset the rest of the group, I need to stay in the group, but I'm going to move to the sort of outer edges, hide away, not use too much food, probably want to stay awake just in case anyone is going to harm me in some way, and essentially retreat until the danger's over and I can be accepted back into the tribe again. So the idea is that in modern times, we have lots of stimuli in the environment which tell us we've lost social status. So not getting the job that we wanted. What else? What other kind of things? Watching TV and seeing these impossible lifestyles that other people live, living in Monaco, and thinking, oh my God, why don't we have that? So there's lots of, and advertisers know this very well, they will intentionally stimulate our social threat in order to get us to buy products to make ourselves more beautiful, more successful, etc. And so one of the issues with depression then is we have a perceived drop in social status, and therefore our bodies and brains retreat. And so part of the treatment then is to really push the person to do the things that they used to do, even though that they don't feel like it and they don't feel motivated to do it. So that kind of real clinical depression where someone is in that completely retreated phase, it's not just I feel a bit down. It is something very different, and it's incredibly debilitating. And when it becomes very severe, people can start to experience psychotic phenomena as well. And people may need to, in extreme cases, people have to be hospitalized, in very severe cases of depression.
It's interesting what you said about you see these lives in Monaco, F1 drivers or phenomenally rich superstars. And we also see it in, this is one of the things, talking about the younger generation. My 14-year-old watches a lot of TikTok, and a lot of that is nonsense, aspirational, crazy stuff where people show you around these houses and they have swimming pools and a lot of it's just not true. And I wonder whether we would be mentally healthier as people generally if we could kind of hold that nonsense at bay and disconnect from the commercialization of everything around us.
Yeah, I agree entirely, because your son or your daughter watching TikTok and seeing these unattainable lifestyles in the person, in her brain or his brain, that's the top, that's the chieftain of the tribe, and that's where we're aspiring to. But as you say, it's not possible. So if our mood is going to be related to where we feel we fit in the group. And if we perceive we're far lower down, then again, that's going to make us feel low, create anxiety, could lead to difficulties like depression, because we enter this kind of helpless, hopeless state. So I agree with you. It would be social media. Social media has got a lot to answer for in terms of the uptick in mental health diagnoses amongst young people, for sure.
Yes, and and anxiety to a certain extent. And I saw you. I was really interested in the way you spoke about anxiety. I saw a video of you online talking about anxiety, and you were talking about the difference between thinking brains and instinctive brains, and the fact that us as humans, I'm kind of paraphrasing, I might have got you wrong, but we've evolved technically very quickly, and we can put men on the moon and telescopes to the furthest reaches of space, but we've not evolved emotionally at the same pace. So we still, and you were given this brilliant example of, we still feel as if we're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger. So we have that kind of, that's where the anxiety comes from. It's the same feeling, even though there's no tigers coming to kill us.
Yes. Yeah. And if a tiger's coming to kill us, then once we've got away and we're safe, our threat system can then slow down, we can rest, we can digest, and we can get on with the rest of our day. But unfortunately, modern society with social media and all of the pressures and the advertising around us, it's as if we're being chased by hundreds of saber-toothed tigers all day long. And also the kind of built-up environments that we live in as well are not very good for our mental health. It's important for us to be able to see either the sea or fields or trees in order for us to feel safe.
And what I liked was, if you don't mind, if you in this video that I watched of you briefly gave some ways when we are feeling really anxious. And I say this because it really touched me. It resonated with me, because I spend a lot of my time feeling anxious and going, right, there's nothing, I'm not being chased by a tiger. I just got to sit down here and work it out. And you did a kind of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 thing. Would you mind just taking us through that briefly?
Yeah, sure. So essentially the first thing is that we need to recognize that our threat system has been activated, and so our brains work on this better safe than sorry principle. The reason that you're sat here, you're sat there and you get anxious at times, and I'm sitting here and I get anxious at times, is because our ancestors were really good at looking out for danger, and we are highly attuned to any danger. So the first thing we need to do is think, okay, am I in mortal danger here? Yes or no? And if the answer is no, then we can then move on, which is, 99.9% of the cases we're not in any mortal danger. is then we can think about, maybe we can think, well, what's triggered this? Why might I be feeling, why might my threat system be activated? Oh yeah, it was a email from my boss, or it was a bill dropping through the door, whatever it is that's activated the threat system. So the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 technique is a way of telling your body and your brain that there is no danger. So what we're doing is engaging all of our senses. So 5 is to, first of all, notice 5 things that you can see around you. And just to give a bit of background, when we're feeling under threat, our focus will narrow onto whatever we feel is threatening, whether it's the saber-toothed tiger or the bill that's come through the door or the email from the boss. So by intentionally broadening our awareness, we're sending an implicit message. Actually, it's perfectly safe. We're not about to be killed. And so you can start by just slowly looking around the room from left to right and just notice 5 things that you can see. I can see the cat dish, I can see a lamp, a cushion, the tree outside. But do it very, very slowly. Allow your head to move around. So that's 5. So 5 things that you can see. And then the next thing we want to do is 4 things that we can touch. So you've probably heard of the idea of grounding. When we get anxious, we get lost in our head and we really lose touch with our body. So actually just noticing the way our feet feel on the floor, holding the arms of your chair, noticing the fabric of the seat that you're sat on, perhaps noticing the fabric of your clothes, maybe touch your hair if you're lucky to still have hair, touch your hair. And so you have that physical contact with 4 items, with the idea you're grounding and getting yourself back into your body again, rather than caught up in this loop of unhelpful thinking. So that's the 4 things. Then we want to notice 3 things that we can hear. So again, this would involve just being very quiet, maybe closing your eyes, and then just noticing 3 things you can hear. So if I asked you now, Marcus, if you just slow down for a moment, what are the 3 things that you can hear right now?
I can hear my computer. And I can faintly hear traffic outside. And I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah. And isn't it interesting how we can redirect our attention like that? And I know you have anyway, because I've seen them. You've done some podcasts on mindfulness. And so what we're doing here is very much a mindful exercise, as well as really slowing down, focusing our attention on our ability to hear, and then choosing to move our attention from one noise to another. So then the 2 is to notice 2 things that you can smell. So that can be a little hard. So it might be whatever deodorant or cologne you're wearing. It might be the smell of the traffic or something like that. And then finally, the 1 is notice something that you can taste. And what's really helpful as well is to swill the saliva around your mouth a little bit, and then to swallow the saliva, or even have a little sip of water or coffee. And so the idea is that if we engage our digestive system, it's also a very powerful message to our threat system that we're not in immediate danger. Because if we're going to eat or drink, it means we're not in danger. Because if you're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, you're not going to stop to eat a banana or have a cup of tea.
Yeah. Do you know what? I like that, because I read a lot of things online or in magazines, and it'll say, in order to get your head back in tune, if you can do an hour's worth of meditation a day. And I think, well, I don't have an hour, because, my alarm goes off at 6:45 and I've got 3 kids. And at that point, the house starts going at 60 miles an hour. It's breakfasts and school runs and lost shoes and craziness and homework that's been undone. So,
yeah.
And I think the danger there is that this probably applies to a ton of people out there, whether you got kids or not. From the moment you open your eyes, you're on the go. But
Yeah.
what you've described there is quite nice, because when you stop, when you get to your work or you've done the school run, you could almost just lock yourself in the toilet cubicle or in the toilet and just take 5 minutes to yourself to bring the pace back down to something that you can manage for the rest of the day. Otherwise, if sometimes I get to like 11:30 or 12 and I'm still going at that 60 mile an hour pace, and I haven't realized that, and I'm doing it for no reason at all.
Yeah, yes, exactly. And so we get caught into a particular track. So it could be a threat system track, or it could be a drive system track where we're just in the go, go, go dopamine kind of pattern, which also is exhausting after a while. And what we need to do is notice we're in threat or notice we're in a drive pattern, and then intentionally just take a moment. And really, you don't even need to do the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 technique. Literally just sitting down, noticing your feet on the floor and taking a deep breath in and then an even slower breath out. Just doing that, which would take less than a minute, is sometimes enough just for you to think, oh gosh, I just need to slow down a minute, or just to be able to reset. So yeah, we don't need to sit around for hours meditating to just reset our nervous system onto a soothing, affiliative state of being.
Anxiety is a perfectly normal emotion to have, but sometimes it can become overwhelming. Fortunately, there's so many little steps you can take to help. And if that's not enough, ScotsCare offers counselling free of charge to its clients. Just get in touch to see if we can help you.
I don't know if this is something you can answer, but do you think that when you're born, people are more or less stressy as people? Because I think I've always been quite a stressy person. I've always been quite a worrier, but I don't know whether that was passed on to me, because I know now that my mum's passed away, but my mum was always a worrier, and now I worry. And I have friends like my friend Duncan doesn't worry at all. Doesn't worry. He's the most laid back person I know. But he also functions, he doesn't just sit around and lie in a beanbag. He has a job and he moves forward and he goes to the gym and he goes to Sainsbury's and, and I just wonder whether he was born that way and I was born another way, or do you think there's an environmental input into it?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I suppose that there are a couple of points that I probably make in response to that. The first is that we all have a genetic heritage and propensity for particular types of behavior, but also our environment is really key in that. So the genetics don't really mean anything without environment. So say if you've been raised by a really laid back mum who was a bit like your friend, then would you still be a worrying, anxious type person? Probably not. So really, when our brains are a little bit like a computer operating system, and then the experiences we have in our formative years are like the software that gets programmed. And so the way that our genes express themselves will fit with the environmental will fit with the environment in which they're operating within. So if you're, for example, like many of the clients we're working with, if you've grown up in an environment that's potentially dangerous and threatening, then your genes are going to develop to survive a world that is dangerous and threatening. And if you grow up in a home where everything is a worry or anxiety provoking, then your genes are going to develop to fit with that kind of environment. But the good news is, I don't know if this is right. Is it? I'm trying to remember A-level biology. I think it was Lamarck who said that our gene expression changes depending on our life experiences, and that was really dismissed. But now we're seeing through epigenetics that that's true. We can change the expression of our genes through practice. And so even if that was your genetic propensity and your environment, you can actually change your response to the environment through meditation, mindfulness, breathing, therapies and so on.
I think that's really interesting, and it's really important because I hope that I give my kids a secure and comforting upbringing, but I am aware that I can be quite a stressy person, and I do in moments of calmness, like when I like I am now, or I'm talking to you. I am aware that I don't want to pass that on to my children, where they grow up and they feel anxious or stressy and can't quite put a finger on it, and they think, oh, because dad was anxious or stressy. So I think I'm having more moments of looking at my feet and just a bit of breathing. I could probably do with a bit of that, actually.
Yeah, so if you don't want to do it for yourself, do it for your kids. But the thing with children as well, as long as children are safe, they know they're loved, and you listen and pay attention to what they're achieving and what they're doing in life, they'll be fine. I wouldn't worry too much about that. And worry is so common as well, isn't it? Probably 3 out of 4 people have a somewhat of a worry problem.
Well, it's difficult not to when you live in the cost of living crisis, mortgage rates, all the stuff that's going on at the moment is, it's very difficult not to worry. And for you, and especially when you're around your kids are smart. They can see whether you're up or down or sideways. They can feel it in the air sometimes, I think.
And perhaps that's a good thing. If it's important that kids are prepared for the world as it is, and that involves understanding that their parents and all the people they interact with have a range of different emotions and have a range of different psychological states. That's helpful information as you're developing.
Now, you're a man of science, but do you think having a faith helps you? Do you think it helps stave off the worries about the world at large?
Well, that's a
big question. Go, Brett, go.
Yeah. Can I just say one thing about the previous question? Just to say one other thing, in terms of genetics and groups, is that if we look at our behaviours from a group perspective, many mental health issues make a lot more sense. So again, if we're in our small tribe, you need some people who have a devil may care attitude and just going to jump ahead to find the new source of food. But you also need people in the group to say, oh, hang on a minute, have we really checked whether that rope bridge is safe first? We need people to do the checking, when we think about OCD, for example. So it can be sometimes helpful to think, actually, would this particular characteristic that I have that is just an annoyance to me, would that have been helpful in a wider group situation to have a few worriers around? And the answer is yes. We need to have that approach in order to make sure we don't, jump into burning pits.
Oh yeah, I totally agree with you. Yeah, in some ways, I wish I was a bit more like that. I think sometimes I tend to skip over the details, whereas my wife's a bit more, hold on, let's just have a look what this actually does say, and saved us on a few occasions in that way.
So I suppose I was buying a bit of time there with the question, having a faith help. I mean, if I was going to give just a brief answer, I'd say overall, yes. So research shows that having a strong spiritual belief or strong faith, it is protective against anxiety, against worry, against certainly against feelings of nihilism and what are we all here for? Because actually, as humans, we want to have we need meaning to make sense of our world. And of course, faith and spirituality gives us a framework of meaning that feels, genuine, feels authentic, and feels real. So it makes a lot of sense that those practices can be really helpful for people. Also, it provides an alternative to the kind of commercial capitalist kind of society that we live in, and so it can be a form of refuge, really, to be able to see the world through a different framework that's not related to money and to belongings and status and so on. I suppose, and I'm thinking more about working with people with severe enduring mental health. Sometimes people's religious beliefs can be used punitively. So someone might believe that they've sinned for some reason, or that their idea of a God isn't a sort of benevolent or loving God, but is a kind of a punitive, angry God. Then in those cases, it can exacerbate people's mental health issues, because they feel not only have they let themselves down, but they're also letting God down, and that kind of thing. So, as with all things, there's not a straightforward answer, but I suppose I would encourage, if I'm working with clients and they're interested in spirituality, I really always encourage them to explore that and talk about it and think about how that helps them, and in what ways that they can use that to, manage their lives more effectively.
Brett, it's been super talking to you. Thank you very much for being on the ScotsCare podcast today. I really enjoyed it. There's so many areas that you and I have just spoke about that I think you could go off and spend a whole hour just talking about one thing. Maybe you come back later on in the series and talk again.
Lovely. I would love to. Thanks very much, Marcus. Thank you for inviting me.
Speak to you later. Tatty bye.
See you. Bye.
ScotsCare, the charity helping to break the cycle of poverty some Scots find in London.